In the history of warfare, we often count the tanks, the airplanes, and the bullets. We study the maps and the movement of divisions. But there is a factor of war that is more immediate, more primal, and more deadly than any weapon. It is the simple, gnawing pain of an empty stomach. For the soldiers fighting in the Pacific Theater from 1941 to 1945, the war was not just a battle against the enemy. It was a battle against the limits of the human body. It was a war of calories. Imagine standing on a tropical island, thousands of miles from home. The humidity is so thick you can taste it. The jungle is alive with insects. But amidst the noise of nature and the distant thunder of artillery, the loudest sound you hear is your own hunger. On one side of the ocean, the United States mobilized the greatest industrial machine the world had ever seen, determined to ship the comforts of home to the furthest reaches of the globe. On the other side, the Empire of Japan relied on a philosophy of spiritual strength, believing that the will of the soldier could overcome the biological need for food. This clash of logistics would decide the fate of the Pacific just as much as the clash of arms. To understand the victory and the tragedy of this war, we must look not at the rifles, but at the rations. Let us begin with the American Marine. When a young man from Kansas or New York arrived on Guadalcanal or Saipan, he brought with him the weight of the American agricultural industry. The United States military planners had a specific goal. They wanted to ensure that no American soldier, no matter how far he was from civilization, would ever face starvation. The result of this effort was the C-Ration. For millions of men, this small, heavy box became the center of their universe. It was packed in olive-drab tin cans that were nearly indestructible. Inside, there was a calculated balance of protein, carbohydrates, and morale. There was the M unit, containing the main course. Usually, this was meat and beans, meat and vegetable hash, or the infamous meat and spaghetti. It was salty, it was mushy, and it had a texture that many soldiers claimed tasted like the can it came in. But it was food. It was reliable. It was safe to eat even after sitting in the baking sun for weeks. Then there was the B unit, the bread and dessert unit. It contained hard biscuits that were so dense they could supposedly stop a bullet. It had hard candy, sugar cubes, and instant coffee. For the American soldier, food was more than fuel. It was a tether to reality. Opening a can of peaches in a foxhole while mortar shells fell nearby was a surreal experience. It was a reminder of a civilized world that still existed somewhere over the horizon. The logistics required to keep this flow of tins moving were staggering. The United States Navy did not just transport ammunition. They transported millions of tons of chocolate, chewing gum, and cigarettes. There is a famous story that illustrates the overwhelming abundance of the American supply chain. Toward the end of the war, the U.S. Navy actually commissioned a concrete barge dedicated solely to making ice cream. It was a floating factory that could produce hundreds of gallons of ice cream every hour, towed behind the fleet to serve the sailors and Marines. To the Japanese observers who saw this, it must have been terrifying. It was not the weapons that frightened them, but the realization that their enemy was so rich, so well supplied, that they could afford to ship frozen desserts to a war zone. But while the Americans complained about the monotony of Spam and beans, the story on the other side of the jungle was drastically different. The Japanese Imperial Army entered the war with a different philosophy. They believed in speed, aggression, and self-sufficiency. The Japanese soldier was trained to travel light. He carried a rifle, ammunition, and a few days' worth of rice in a sock or a tin container. The expectation was that the army would move quickly, seize enemy supplies, and forage from the land. In China, this strategy had worked. The armies could seize grain from local farms. But the Pacific Islands were not China. On islands like Guadalcanal, New Guinea, and Iwo Jima, there were no farms to seize. There were no vast storehouses of grain. There was only jungle, rock, and disease. The Japanese soldier was issued a standard ration called the bento. It was simple: white rice, perhaps some pickled plum, known as umeboshi, to preserve the rice and add flavor. Sometimes there was canned fish or soy sauce. But as the war dragged on, and the American blockade tightened, these rations began to disappear. The turning point was the destruction of the Japanese merchant marine. American submarines aggressively hunted the slow-moving Japanese transport ships. This meant that food destined for the garrisons on the islands often ended up at the bottom of the ocean. Soldiers on the islands would watch the horizon for weeks, praying for a supply ship. When one finally appeared, they would cheer, only to watch in horror as a torpedo trail cut through the water and sent their salvation sinking beneath the waves. This isolation birthed a new, darker reality for the Japanese soldier. They were no longer fighting for the emperor. They were fighting for survival. On Guadalcanal, the situation became so desperate that the island earned a grim nickname among the Japanese troops. They called it Starvation Island. Diaries recovered from Japanese soldiers on Guadalcanal reveal a heartbreaking descent into despair. In the beginning, the entries talk about tactical movements and the glory of battle. But as the weeks turn into months, the entries change. One diary reads, October 20th. No rice left. We are eating roots. October 25th. Cannot walk. Too weak. October 30th. I dream of my mother's cooking. The discipline of the Imperial Army was legendary, but biology is a cruel master. When the rice ran out, the soldiers were forced to forage. They learned to identify edible ferns and roots in the jungle. They hunted lizards, rats, and snakes. But the jungle was not a generous host. Many plants were poisonous. Malaria and dysentery ran rampant through the malnourished ranks. A soldier without food has no immune system. A scratch from a thorn could turn into a fatal infection. While the Americans grumbled about cold coffee, the Japanese were boiling leather belts and shoe soles in a desperate attempt to extract some nutrients from the animal hide. It was a level of suffering that is almost impossible for us to comprehend today. There was also a psychological element to the food. For the Americans, mealtime was a social event. They would gather, swap items from their rations, trade cigarettes for chocolate, and complain together. It bonded them. For the Japanese in the later stages of the war, eating became a secretive, shameful, and dangerous act. Lighting a fire to cook rice was a death sentence. The smoke would reveal their position to American artillery or aircraft. So, they had to cook at night, hiding the flames deep in caves, or eat the rice raw and hard, which caused terrible stomach issues. The Japanese command tried to solve this. They encouraged soldiers to plant gardens on the islands. Garrisons were ordered to grow sweet potatoes and vegetables next to their bunkers. Imagine the scene: soldiers digging defensive trenches in the morning and tending to a vegetable patch in the afternoon, trying to grow food in volcanic ash while waiting for an invasion. But often, the invasion came before the harvest. There is a profound contrast in the artifacts left behind. When you look at the photos of American campsites, you see mountains of trash. Empty tin cans, candy wrappers, cigarette cartons. It is a visual representation of excess. When you look at the Japanese caves, you find meticulous rationing. You find mess kits scraped clean. You find grain sacks that have been shaken out until not a single dust of rice remains. This disparity created a strange dynamic when the two forces finally met in close quarters. American Marines often reported that when they overran a Japanese position, the first thing they noticed was the smell of sickness and starvation. They would find enemy soldiers who were skeletal, weighing less than 80 pounds, yet still manning their machine guns. There are stories of Japanese soldiers who were captured or who surrendered simply because the smell of American cooking wafted across the front lines. The scent of frying bacon or brewing coffee was a psychological weapon more potent than propaganda. On Okinawa, the situation reached its peak. The civilian population was caught in the middle. The Japanese army, starving and desperate, began to confiscate food from the local Okinawans. The defenders of the island became competitors for the limited resources. Meanwhile, the Americans landed with floating supermarkets. They brought refrigeration ships. They brought fresh eggs. They brought steak. There is a recorded incident where a Japanese officer, hiding in a cave, observed an American patrol taking a break. He watched through his binoculars as a Marine opened a can of Spam, took a bite, made a face of disgust, and threw the rest of the can into the bushes. To the starving officer, seeing half a can of meat thrown away as garbage was a shock to his system. It broke his spirit more than the tanks did. He realized that he was fighting a nation that could afford to throw away food. The war ended in 1945, but the impact of this caloric disparity lasted for a generation. When the surrender finally came, and the American occupation forces landed in Japan, they found a nation on the brink of famine. The blockade had worked. The distribution systems had collapsed. The Americans, the former enemy, suddenly became the providers. The massive logistical machine that had pumped rations to the Marines was turned toward feeding the Japanese civilians. Grain and canned goods flowed into the cities. There is a famous image from the occupation of a Japanese child receiving a chocolate bar from a GI. It is a cliché, but it represents a profound truth. The power of the United States was demonstrated not just by the atomic bomb, but by the chocolate bar. It demonstrated a mastery over the material world that the Japanese leadership had failed to achieve. Today, when we look back at the history of the Pacific War, we must remember the quiet moments between the battles. We must remember the Marines sitting in the rain, heating a cup of coffee on a small chemical stove, finding a moment of warmth in a cold world. And we must remember the Japanese soldier in the dark cave, tightening his belt one notch further, writing a poem about the harvest festival back home, knowing he would never taste rice again. It serves as a reminder that logistics is not just a column on a spreadsheet. It is the difference between life and death. It is the fuel of armies. And in the brutal mathematics of war, the side that can feed its men is the side that wins the future. The silence of the jungle has returned,